our last topic, we saw that we wanted to help our physical and spiritual children and learn from the example of Abram that when we lie, it'll have a negative effect on others, on ourselves, and on our children. Abram had to learn that lesson the hard way by being expelled from Egypt with everything he had. In this topic, we will see that Abram learned the benefits of letting God guide him to make wise choices. In Genesis 13, verse 1 through 7, we read, "Then Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife, and all that he had, and Lot with him, to the south. Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold. And he went on his journey from the south, as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place of the altar which he had made there at first. And there Abram called on the name of the Lord. Lot also, who went with Abram, had flocks and herds and tents. Now the land was not able to support them, that they might dwell together, for their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. The Canaanites and the Perizzites then dwelt in that land." Here we see what happened when Abram returned from Egypt. When Abram and Sarai, along with everyone and everything that they had, returned from Egypt, they went to the south part of Canaan, also known as Negev. The Lord had been blessing Abram as he had promised when he made a covenant with him. As a result, Abram had become very rich in livestock, silver, and gold. As Abram continued to move with his cattle and flocks, they moved from the south as far north as Bethel. This was the place where Abram had first gone when he came into the land of Canaan and the Lord had appeared to him. Genesis 12, verse 7 through 8 says, "Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, 'To your descendants I will give this land.' And there he built an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. And he moved from there to the mountain east of Bethel, and he pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord." At that time, Abram had built an altar to the Lord. Here we see that Abram returned to the place where he had built an altar. This showed his desire to fully restore his fellowship with God. Meanwhile, Lot, the nephew of Abram, was traveling with him. Abram had been told to leave his family, but he brought Lot with him because the father of Lot had died before they left Ur. Now that was beginning to cause conflict. The wealth of Lot had also increased, and he also had flocks, herds, and tents. The fact that both men had large flocks and herds created this conflict. The land could not grow grass fast enough to feed both of the herds and flocks. The herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock began to have conflicts between them because they both needed more grass for their flocks. In addition, there were also Canaanites and Perizzites that lived in that area. As a result, Abram let God show him a way to avoid conflict with Lot. Genesis 13, verse 8 through 13 says, "So Abram said to Lot, 'Please, let there be no strife between you and me, and between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brethren. Is not the whole land before you? Please separate from me. If you take the left, I will go to the right. If you take the right, then I will go to the left.' And Lot lifted his eyes and saw all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt as you go toward Zoar. Then Lot chose for himself all the plain and the Jordan, and Lot journeyed east, and they separated from each other. Abram dwelt in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelt in the cities of the plain and pitched his tent even as far as Sodom. But the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked and sinful against the Lord. Abram was the leader, but we see that he gave Lot the opportunity to make the choice about the land that he wanted. These verses teach us two key lessons about resolving conflict. First, Abram took the leadership to discuss the problem with Lot. He reminded Lot that they were brethren and made it clear that they needed to resolve conflicts. He told Lot that they needed to separate so there would be no conflict between their herdsmen. Second, Abram showed servant leadership by giving Lot the opportunity to choose which part of the land he wanted. Abram was learning that he could trust God to lead him instead of trying to make sure that he got what he wanted. 2 Corinthians 5 verse 7 says, "For we walk by faith, not by sight. Then Hebrews 11 verses 9 through 10 speaks about the faith of Abraham when those verses say, "By faith he dwelt in the land of promise as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God." Abram was learning not to focus on what he saw, but to focus on the city whose builder is God. However, we see that Lot was walking by sight instead of by faith. Abram gave Lot the choice to choose to the right or to the left, and said that he would go the opposite way. Lot looked carefully in both directions. Since they were on the mountain ridge, he could see all the plain of Jordan. He saw that the plain of Jordan was well watered everywhere. Even from a distance, he could see the whole plain was green. This was before the Lord destroyed the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. In fact, we see that the plain was compared to the garden of the Lord. Genesis 2 verse 10 says, "Now a river went out from Eden to water the garden, and from there it parted and became 4 riverheads." We see that the Garden of Eden had been well watered, which made it very beautiful. Abram and Lot had just come from Egypt, so Lot saw that the area was similar to the land along the Nile River. Sodom and Gomorrah were close to the city of Zoar, which was nearest to the south end of the Dead Sea. Lot would later flee to the city of Zoar when Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed. Lot chose the Jordan Plain on the east because it was such a beautiful green area due to the fact that it was well watered. This meant that he left the land to the west of the mountains as the place for Abram to live. However, we see that Lot also made a second choice. He set up his tent close to the city of Sodom. We read that the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked and sinful against the Lord. Genesis 19 verse 45 says, "Now before they lay down, the men in the city of Sodom, both old and young, all the people from every quarter surrounded the house. And they called to Lot and said to him, 'Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so we may know them carnally.'" Jude 7 adds, "As Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them, in this similar manner to having these given themselves over to sexual immorality and gone after strange flesh, are set forth as an example, suffering the vengeance of eternal fire." Here we see that God judged these cities because they were exceedingly evil. In contrast, we see that the Lord blessed Abram after he separated from Lot. Genesis 13 verse 14 through 18 says, "And the Lord said to Abram after Lot had separated from him, 'Lift your eyes now and look to the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, and westward. For all the land which you see I give to you and your descendants forever. And I will make your descendants as the dust on the earth, so that if a man could number the dust on the earth, then your descendants also could be numbered. Arise, walk in the land through its length and its width, for I give it to you.' Then Abram moved his tent and went and dwelt in the terebinth trees of Mamre, which are in Hebron, and built an altar there to the Lord." Abram had let Lot choose because Abram was learning to walk by faith. Here we see that God honored that faith by speaking to Abram after Lot had separated from him and moved towards the city of Sodom. Abram was still on the mountain where he could see all 4 directions. God told Abram to carefully look all 4 directions. Then God reminded Abram of the promise that he had given to Abram in Genesis 12 verse 1. "Now the Lord said to Abram, 'Get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you.'" Abram had separated from the last family member, with Lot leaving and moving towards Sodom. God immediately reminded him of the promise that God had given him by telling him to look in all 4 directions. God said, "All the land which you see I will give to you and your descendants forever." Here we see that God reminded Abram of the fact that this was the land he had promised would belong to the descendants of Abram forever. This promise is still in effect because God said it was forever. This promise means that the day will come in the future when the descendants of Abram will continue to occupy the land that God had promised to him. In addition, God reminded Abram of the promise he had made to Abram and his descendants. This promise is in Genesis 13 verse 6, which says, "And I will make your descendants as the dust on the earth, so that if any man could number the dust on the earth, then your descendants also could be numbered." Here we see that God reminded Abram that the number of descendants would become so great they could not be counted. God also kept this promise about the number of descendants that Abram would have. Then God told Abram to walk through the land so that he could personally see the land God had promised to his descendants. One of the places to which Abram moved his tent was to an area called Hebron. There, Abram built another altar to the Lord. Here we see the growing faith of Abram as he made certain that the first thing he did when he got to the place was to build an altar. We want to help our physical and spiritual children learn to explain how the faith of Abraham grew as he was learning to walk by faith. This will help our children in the learning process as they learn to walk by faith in their own lives. May the Lord richly bless you as you show your children by your own life what it means to walk by faith.